Hello, my name is Shoaib, and welcome to the Sound and Vision 100 Years of the BBC in Berlin. This podcast is produced by Humboldt University's Center for British Studies, and today I have with me Professor Richard Aldous. He's a Eugene Meyer Professor of British History at Bard College, New York. Educated in London and Cambridge, Professor Aldous taught for 15 years at University College Dublin, where he was head of the School of History and Archives. He's the author of 12 books, including the forthcoming in the autumn, The Dillon Era, Douglas Dillon in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administration. He now writes mainly for American publication, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, as well as providing television commentary for Spectrum News, NY1, and CNN, and being a founding member of the editorial teams at American Purpose, the magazine set up by Francis Fukuyama in 2020. Professor Aldous, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity and your time, and welcome to our podcast. So let's just start with your area of expertise span historical studies, Victorian studies, and international and global studies, and also history of the English music as well. You have published and edited widely on subjects relating to British and European politics and history. Could you please tell us a bit about your professional background, your interest in Anglo-American relations, as well as your interest in European history in general? Why are these research areas of particular interest to you?
Well, first of all, Shoaib, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I'm a great admirer of what is done in British studies at Humboldt, and Miles Taylor, who's a very important figure there, is somebody I've known for many years and greatly admire his work. In terms of my own background, I've always been very interested in the transatlantic world. And in many ways, I think a lot of what I've done has been rooted in the 1950s and 60s. So politically, I've worked on Harold Macmillan and Eisenhower's relationship with Kennedy. I've written books on Americans like Arthur Schlesinger, who were big in the 50s and 60s. I've got a new book on Douglas Dillon, which is coming out in the autumn. Again, another important 50s and 60s figure. And some of the other books that I've written are people who come out of the 50s and 60s, like Margaret Thatcher, who was first elected in 1959, or that those figures look back to. So the book that I wrote on Gladstone and Disraeli, Harold Macmillan's great hero, for example, was Benjamin Disraeli. So, I think that in some senses, although I've spanned widely, a lot of what I've done comes back to this interest in the post-war world, whether that's kind of Britain or the United States. In terms of my own background, as you said earlier, I did my PhD at Cambridge, working with David Reynolds, who of course is one of those great scholars of the transatlantic world. I began working with him on Anglo-American relations, and then I spent a couple of years in Southampton before moving to Dublin, University College Dublin, and then coming to Bard. And I think it is worth saying that, in many ways, I feel that those moves have been important for me in terms of my scholarship, but that a lot of what I do is kind of British history, but rather like yourselves there in Berlin, seeing Britain from the outside, looking at it whilst at the same time living these different experiences outside the country, I think has definitely had an influence on the way in which I think about Britain and the way that I think about British history.
Yeah, Professor, you have written more than 10 books, and most of them are about historical figures, about prime ministers and presidents, and about a pilot and an orchestra conductor as well. Can I ask, how do you choose the personalia, about which you're writing about?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they're kind of one book leads on from another. So, for example, when I wrote the Arthur Schlesinger book, which was about the Kennedy administration, and Douglas Dillon emerged within that book as when I was working on that book, as somebody who I thought was very interesting. So when I had the opportunity to have access to his papers, it was a very straightforward choice for me. Sometimes books have been suggested to me, other times they've come out of other books. I think in some ways you get two different kinds of scholars. I remember John Lewis Gaddis talking about this, where he divides historians into lumpers and splitters, and by lumpers he tends to mean that, you know, people who push things together and are interested in big ideas and the kind of the movement of history, and splitters who kind of tend to work on the same thing but constantly looking at the different nuances and areas of this. And of course, you have to have both. But I'm definitely a lumper, and I'm somebody who tends to, when I've written one book, I want to move on to something different and to have a different kind of challenge. So, you know, as I said in my first answer, I think there is a link between a lot of the things that I've done, but very often I finish a book and I think, okay, what's next? I want to do something that is going to give me a fresh kind of challenge. Ironically, I then sometimes come back to those other things later, where I realize that maybe there are things that were unexplored that I'd like to look at again.
So I'd like to talk about like one of your books, like Tunes of Glory, the life of Malcolm Sargent. It's devoted to an excavating from obscurity the life, works, and talent of one of the greatest conductors in history, Sir Malcolm Sargent. He was the chief conductor of the BBC Symphony Orchestra from in the 50s, I would say. And when he took over, he was faced with quite a daunting task, if I may say, about to rescue the dysfunctional orchestra with low morale and almost no finesse. Could this perilous state of BBC's orchestra in the 50s be attributed solely to the legacy of Sir Adrian Boult, or was it indicative of the wider disarray in BBC music and the BBC's status as a whole following the World War II?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, when Sargent took over the BBC Symphony Orchestra, they weren't in particularly good shape at that time. I mean, just to say something about Sargent himself first, that he was a figure born at the end of the 19th century, into very modest circumstances, actually. You know, his father was a clerk in a coal yard, so in some ways a Bob Cratchit type figure for listeners who know Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So worked his way up and kind of becomes a very prominent figure, both musically and socially. In the pre-war period, he's actually a very radical figure. He works with Stravinsky, for example, in London. When Stravinsky comes to London, he also sets up a new orchestra, what will become the London Philharmonic Orchestra. He does a kind of a series of very famous concerts called the Courtauld Sargent concerts that are noted for their performance of new works. And then during the Second World War becomes not only a national figure, but an international figure. Firstly, for the tours, the Blitz tours that he did around the country, literally performing while the bombs were raining down during the war, but then also for a BBC radio program that he did that was broadcast throughout not just Britain but throughout the empire, and makes him a genuine celebrity. So when he takes over the BBC Symphony Orchestra in the 1950s, as you say, he's not only one of the most famous musicians in Britain, he's one of Britain's most well-known celebrities, an instantly recognizable figure. And I think that is both the root of his success, but it's also part of the reason why he has a very hard time when he goes to the BBC Symphony Orchestra. They want his glamour. They want his celebrity. He'd already done a wonderful job on the BBC Proms, which in the immediate post-war period, were in a kind of, again, in a somewhat parlous state. but they moved to television. He kind of glamorized the whole thing, and they were getting tremendous publicity for that. The BBC wanted the same thing for their symphony orchestra, which in a previous period, Toscanini, the great Italian conductor, had described as one of the best orchestras in the world. But by the 1950s, it really was in a pretty low state, poor morale, players who perhaps were past their best and so on. So he comes in 1950 with an agenda to improve the orchestra, but that turns out to be a very, very difficult and tumultuous experience, not just for him, but for the orchestra and for BBC Music more broadly.
But why do you think, why was it like difficult for an organization like BBC to secure a chief conductor after the war?
I think partly because it's a different kind of orchestral job to most of the ones that you would get, that because it's part of an organization, it's part of a bureaucracy. And this is one of the struggles, in fact, that Sargent would have, that, you know, you see memos where people say, well, he's not spending time in his office. You know, he needs to be in the building a bit more. And, you know, that's just not really the way that conductors work, that it's difficult to imagine Kirill Petrenko or Simon Rattle or any of these major figures of today being criticized because they're not spending enough time in the office doing paperwork, going to meetings and doing the kind of the bureaucracy that, you know, I think there's a sense with an orchestra outside of a bureaucracy like that, that the conductor's job is to conduct and to think about the musical planning elements of what's going on, but is not really somebody who's an official in that kind of sense. I mean, it would be interesting to know whether, for example, Simon Rattle, who's just gone to the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, whether there are some of these elements in an organization like that, and whether that's a point of comparison. But I somehow imagine that they're not going to be criticizing Simon Rattle for not being in the office on a regular basis.
And if I may ask, like, what would have been the political implications had BBC like failed to get a successor for when Bol in the 50s?
Yeah, I mean, I think they always would have got a successor. The question is whether they get a big name like someone like Sargent. And, you know, there were at different times, there were people who were suggested. Raphael Kubelik, who goes on to become music director of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Sir John Barbaroli, a very distinguished British conductor at that time at the Halle Orchestra. So there are these names that are in the house. But by the time that Sargent gets the job in 1950, you know, they really have put all their eggs into that basket. They really need him. It would have been a humiliation if they hadn't got him. But they always would have got somebody. But with these kind of jobs, we've just kind of seen it here in New York, in fact, that the New York Philharmonic have just appointed Gustavo Dudamel, one of the most famous conductors in the world now, as their new music director, and it's had an energizing effect, not just on the orchestra, but really on kind of cultural life in the city, even before he's arrived.
And Sargent was a huge name, but like, how fair would that statement be that Sargent, like, he stamped his personality indelibly on the proms after taking over at the BBC's symphony orchestra? And what was the role of the proms in the post-war British culture?
Yeah, I mean, the proms are incredibly important for the BBC. They are also incredibly important for musical life in Britain more generally. And, you know, I think that, I mean, kind of you have the BBC orchestras playing, but you also have foreign orchestras, overseas orchestras visiting and so on. It's an opportunity for all the other British orchestras to play. And it's a wonderfully democratic experience that the way in which, for those listeners who don't know much about the proms, that you have traditional tickets where people are seated, but the kind of the main body of the Royal Albert Hall has the seats stripped out, and the promenaders are people who've queued up for tickets, and they stand throughout the concerts, and their tickets cost virtually nothing. So it's always been this kind of very democratic way of making classical music, which is often seen, not always fairly, I think, but is always seen as an elitist kind of occupation. This is a way of making it open to anybody who wants to come along. And there are people who get season tickets for the proms. They take place every night. There are people who go to every concert throughout the summer season, which begins in the middle of July and finishes in early September.
And in your book, you mentioned that like Sargent had an extremely modern view of the role of the chief conductor, and he was very progressive in his reforms. But at the same time, as far as his musical tastes are concerned, he's often described as anti-modernist. Do you think, is there a misrepresentation or misconception of his image as a progressive reformer? Or on the one hand, and a conservative musician, is it possible to somehow, like, if we say, like, reconcile those two aspects of his personality?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and I would answer it as a kind of as a historian and biographer always would, by referring us back to the chronology. That the point is that when Sargent was a younger man, he was always a radical figure and was seen as a radical figure. He premiered things like Walton's Belshazzar's Feast. As I say, he shared the podium with Stravinsky in the 1920s. The work that he did with various choral societies revolutionized choral music in Britain, so much so that Toscanini called him the greatest choral conductor in the world. So he raised orchestral standards and premiered many new works during that period. But by the time you get to the end of his career in the 1960s, he is a much more conservative figure, much less likely to happily premiere new works and so on. And I think that our image of him has been completely dominated by the older figure, so that people have forgotten the more radical figure, who, as you rightly say, was still doing things to raise orchestral standards, even in the 1950s, which is towards the kind of the back end of his career. But things like introducing rotation into string seating in the orchestra, which was something that was widely copied, very unpopular, but he forced the musicians to re-audition for their own jobs in the orchestra, which, as you kind of hinted at there, caused a lot of bitterness in the orchestra. Sometimes we forget that musicians, orchestral musicians, as well as being these wonderful artists, are people who have to think about things like paying the mortgage and their families and so on. So it's always a balance between wanting the highest orchestral standards whilst at the same time recognizing the kind of everyday conditions under which orchestral musicians work. But I think that Sargent's consistent throughout Sargent's life and career was this kind of determination to always try to raise standards, to make the orchestras and musical life in Britain as good as it could possibly be. I think it's also worth pointing out on the modernist question that he was always somebody who he was never a serialist. He never particularly liked the music of Webern and Schoenberg and Berg and so on. But he was a great advocate of tonal composers like Sibelius and Shostakovich, and Vaughan Williams, many of whose work he gave premieres for, or British or European premieres. So it's a particular kind of modern music, but what it very definitely wasn't was atonality and serialism.
Mm-hmm. And if we look at the interwar years, while Sargent's popularity overseas was on the rise, but his relations with the British orchestras were going bad, which resulted in palpable hostility and strained relations between the two. Did the change in attitude have something to do with his character, or was it the image that the press, particularly Daily Telegraph, created and cultivated following the interview that he gave to the newspapers in, I believe, 1936?
Yeah, it goes exactly back to that moment that you've just described there, that Sargent had been very, very ill during the 1930s, came very close to death. And during that time, orchestras had, passed the hat round to raise money for him, had done benefit concerts for him, and so on. And he was very well liked and very well regarded as a young conductor. And then he gave an interview, as you say, where he talked about orchestral members having to kind of give their lifeblood in every performance, and if they weren't up to it anymore, then they should be out. And that caused huge resentment, partly because just the idea that they weren't always giving of their best kind of caused offense, but also particularly because they had done so much to support him and help him in that kind of period when he'd been seriously ill. And I think it's fair to say they never forgot that. So there was always a somewhat strained relationship with orchestras throughout the rest of his career. However, it is worth pointing out that there were many musicians who did still greatly admire him. When I was researching the book, I was actually surprised at how many of the people that I interviewed said, well, even though there was this kind of this hostility, actually, we still admired his musicianship and recognized that he brought in work for orchestras. And sometimes he showed great loyalty to orchestras. For example, when the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra came very close to collapse after the death of its founder, Thomas Beecham, Sargent stepped in and toured widely with them, conducted regularly with them, basically in a way to keep that orchestra alive. And when I spoke to somebody called Brian Smith, who was a one-time chairman of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, he recognized that there was this ambiguity between the old hostility, but also a recognition that Sargent had pretty much saved the orchestra during those troubling times when it looked as if the orchestra might actually collapse. So, I think there was a contradiction in there between the historic, if you like, resentment, where orchestras have long memories, but also a recognition of his musical qualities and his star power as well, his ability to bring in audiences.
So Malcolm Sargent, he conducted the opening concerts for the 1951 Festival of Britain, which was broadcasted live on the BBC Third programme. It was a 5-month celebration of British culture and history, which came to signify the national recovery from the calamities of the Second World War and a defiance against austerity and rationing. But at the same time, it was a time when the Cold War was in full swing. Was classical music pivotal to fostering the reconstruction of British national identity and promising a bright future?
Well, that's certainly what the Attlee government had in mind with the Festival of Britain, that this was, as you say, supposed to be a celebration of kind of British culture, something that would really I suppose celebrate the victory in the war, but more than that, the kind of the creation, the cultural creation of what was often described as the New Jerusalem of the kind of the post-war period. That nobody wanted to go back to the 1930s and the world of the Depression. So, all of these things like the creation of the National Health Service, as the kind of most famous example of the kind of the welfare state, were supposed to symbolize and create this kind of better post-war world for everybody in a way that would be more democratic, more egalitarian. And so the Festival of Britain was kind of part of that, but it was also supposed to celebrate modernity and newness, a kind of an ability to Britain to recreate itself, to build something out of the ashes of the war. After all, don't forget that the war had been a physically very destructive thing, as well as kind of emotionally, that so many of the kind of the British cities had been destroyed. Many of the medieval beauties of Britain had been razed to the ground. And so again, there was this kind of sense of how do we create something new and vibrant and dynamic to come out of this. So the Festival of Britain was kind of part of that. Music was kind of seen as an important element of that, symbolized by the building of the new festival hall as the kind of the premier venue to replace the old Queen's Hall, which had been destroyed in the war. So yeah, I mean, this was a time of austerity, but it was also a time of trying to kind of create a new kind of confidence, a faith in newness and the future, and classical music definitely was playing its part in that.
Could you please tell us a bit about Sargent's tour to Germany? In your book, you mentioned that when Sargent performed with the BBC's orchestra in Dusseldorf in 1958, and a German critic described him as master of the art. Why did he enjoy such high critical acclaim among the German experts?
I think that by and large, Sargent was highly regarded outside of Britain, kind of more generally. That particularly with choral works. I mean, you mentioned that touring with the BBC orchestra. He also often toured with the Huddersfield Choral Society, which at that time was widely seen as one of the best orchestras in the world. And those occasions, tours to Berlin and Vienna and kind of around Germany, were kind of real highlights of the cultural year. So I think that he was admired particularly for those kind of choral works, but also when the BBC Symphony Orchestra went abroad by the late 1950s. He'd been with the orchestra for many years. There had been changes in personnel. There was a general sense that the standard of the orchestra had improved immeasurably. I mean, ironically, when he effectively gets fired by the BBC's concert orchestra at the end of the 50s, it's at a time when the orchestra standing is as high as it had been, arguably, since before the Second World War, and going back to the 30s when it was so generally well regarded. I think as well that a lot of it is that Sargent would very often tour with English music, and English music was not that widely played in Germany. The famous jibe before the First World War was a German jibe, that England was a land without music. And although composers like Elgar and Holst kind of have become more popular in Germany more recently, I mean, obviously, that when Simon Rattle was at the Berlin Philharmonic, but Kirill Petrenko, for example, has conducted Elgar. Daniel Barenboim has conducted a lot of Elgar with his orchestra in Berlin. But I think that the repertoire was less well known in the 1950s. And so anybody listening to it would have been struck, I think, by the continuities with the great German Romantic composers, which is why it had been so popular in the early part of the 20th century, not least with Richard Strauss, who was a great admirer of Elgar. So I think it's a combination of the orchestra was very good, that Sargent was well regarded, but also a lot of the music was less familiar, and the audiences actually found that they rather liked it.
Mm-hmm. But like in the mid 50s, the classical music radio output of the BBC was dominated by the works of the Viennese classics, such as Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach. Did this domination change leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall?
So the kind of music that gets played on the BBC gets completely changed during the 1960s. That there's a revolution that occurs within BBC music, led by a man called Sir William Glock, who was a modernist. He at one stage he brings in Pierre Boulez as the conductor of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, who's the high priest of modernism. In many ways. So yes, there's a big change. What also tends to happen is that audience interest in BBC music and BBC Radio 3, the BBC Symphony Orchestra drops off a cliff during that kind of period, because a lot of the modern music and contemporary music that is played has very little interest for listener figures. At one stage, the BBC's official, Radio 3's official historian works out that the number of people listening in terms of total listenership in Britain is less than 1%. So statistically, literally nobody was listening. But I think that the other part of that question is the role that classical music plays during the kind of the period of détente in the Cold War. In the 1960s, you start to see orchestras going to 60s and 70s, I should say, starting to go to places like the Soviet Union. They'll also then later go to China as well. So culture does become an important part of détente and the kind of the ways of kind of breaking down barriers between East and West, of kind of I suppose what we sometimes now refer to as soft diplomacy during that period. And then when the wall itself comes down, as you will know better than me, but I can still remember, although you wouldn't have been alive at the time, I suspect, but I can still remember the two great concerts that kind of became symbols of that moment. The first with Daniel Barenboim, a performance of Beethoven's first piano concerto, I think, and certainly Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, when citizens from East Berlin were invited to the Philharmonie to hear the Berlin Philharmonic. And you can actually go to the Berlin Philharmonic's digital concert hall and watch this concert, and you just see these citizens of East Berlin with tears streaming down their faces. Many had been reunited with family members that perhaps they hadn't seen for perhaps decades even. Is an incredibly powerful and moving moment. And then there was the concert with Leonard Bernstein, where he brought together a kind of an international orchestra and conducted Beethoven's Choral Symphony at the end of 1989. And again, a kind of a very emotional moment, and kind of something that symbolized the ending of the Cold War. So, I think that music and the Cold War is something that is kind of closely intertwined. And I would refer listeners to a book which is about to come out by a wonderful scholar called Joseph Horowitz. Some people may have read his brilliant biography of Toscanini called Understanding Toscanini. He has a new book coming out on music and the Cold War in the 1960s that I've read the proofs of. Fantastic book, fantastic.
Mm-hmm. And talking about Germany and classical music as well, if I may ask, what, in your opinion, was the significance of classical music in reconstruction of the post-war Germany, and why did many German people in the Federal Republic seek refuge in the works of the great composers?
That's a really interesting question. I can only really speculate. It's kind of outside my area of expertise, but I think that the Berlin Philharmonic during the Cold War was a great symbol of Western freedom, and the fact that the Berlin Philharmonic was arguably the best orchestra in the world. Conducted certainly by the most famous conductor in the world, Herbert von Karajan, that it clearly was a kind of a cultural beacon. And then, a different, there's a different kind of element after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It kind of seems to me that the Berlin Philharmonic retains its kind of place as one of the great orchestras, but I imagine that it kind of adapts to becoming an orchestra for the entire city in ways that are kind of inclusive. For example, I know that when Simon Rattle became chief conductor of the orchestra, a lot of the work that he did was about kind of going into kind of areas of kind of urban poverty. So whereas perhaps the orchestra had been associated with the wealth of West Berlin kind of during the Cold War, kind of latterly it extends its brief. And there was a very famous performance that Simon Rattle did of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, using school children from throughout the city in some of the poorest areas who perhaps had never been introduced to music and ballet and so on before. So I think that the orchestra in those kind of ways, while still maintaining the very highest orchestral standards, was nevertheless able to kind of do things that kind of spoke to the rebuilding of Berlin, and kind of bringing those kind of divided halves of the city kind of back together.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Berlin, I believe in one of your RT radio episodes, that it is a city that has captured the historical imagination as well as the literary one. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yes, well, I suppose that you think back to the 20s and 30s and kind of people like Christopher Isherwood writing about Berlin, the whole kind of Weimar period, which kind of caught the imagination of kind of so many artists, and then the kind of the darker days of the 1930s with Hitler and the war and the Holocaust, and then post-war with the Cold War. So I think that throughout the 20th century, there's always been this kind of cultural and political fascination with the city, because it's always been at the heart of things. It's at the heart of history, at the heart of power during that period. Kind of whether it's the wars or the kind of I suppose the hot wars of the kind of the earlier part of the century, and then the Cold War of the latter part of the century. So I think that as I say, historically, it's always captured our imagination, but also in this kind of artistic and cultural way too.
Mm-hmm. Uh, I will talk about a bit about your favorite novel, like which is The Spy Who Came In from the Cold by a British author, John le Carre. It's one of your favorite spy novels, right? Could you expand on the literary merit and the political subtleties in this novel?
Well, I suppose that, I mean, John le Carre was the great Cold War novelist, and it's a different kind of Cold War novel, for example, to Ian Fleming, who's who kind of comes the kind of the generation kind of earlier. Le Carre. I mean, a lot of the Spy Who Comes In from the Cold is not set in Berlin, but it's great. The kind of the beginning and the end of the novel have these kind of tremendous kind of scenes set in Berlin that capture the sense of the danger, the jeopardy, the peril involved in moving from one side of the border in kind of Berlin to the other, but also the moral ambiguity of that world that in which kind of both sides are having to undertake actions that are morally and ethically questionable. The extent to which you still know where the line is between right and wrong, good and evil. I mean, that's always at the kind of the heart of Le Carre. I'm kind of reluctant to say too much about the novel because the whole point of that book is that it does turn on a kind of a particular kind of twist, which I certainly wouldn't want to spoil for anybody who hasn't read the book. But I think that I'm as I said before, a great admirer of John le Carre, and I can certainly recommend that book along with Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Smiley's People, which are two of the great Cold War novels. I think as well it's interesting from our perspective as historians as well that John le Carre wrote a very good memoir. His letters have just been published, which are fascinating. And he himself, as well as being this kind of hugely successful best-selling novelist, did actually work for MI6. So he was part of the security world in the same way that Fleming had been part of naval intelligence during the war. So there is this kind of fascinating element in which so much of what he's kind of writing about is drawn on his own experience as kind of part of that intelligence world.
On this point of spoilers and recommendation, if I may ask you, like if you would want to recommend any of maybe your book or any of your favorite books, like someone written by someone else, like to the students of this British Studies program, which one would it be?
So I think, I mean, we're kind of while we're in terms of my own kind of books, well, people can make up their own minds on that. I think that, I mean, I talked about the 50s and 60s kind of before. So I would certainly recommend a book by Simon Ball called The Guardsman, which I think is a very novel way of thinking about the 50s and 60s. It's generational history, something that kind of looks at how the connections between different people that kind of go right back to their school days and university days play out through war and politics and so on. So that's certainly one that I would recommend. And then I think that probably, the works of David Reynolds in terms of foreign policy for thinking about this kind of transatlantic world. And his book on Churchill's memoirs is an incredibly skillful and kind of well put together, an imaginative kind of book that takes a kind of an iconic figure like Churchill, but manages to kind of deconstruct him and think about him in a completely new and original way. So I think that kind of those two books in kind of particular are kind of worth looking at. There's also, when you're kind of thinking about the kind of the post-war world, there's also a kind of a wonderful book called Not 1 Inch, which looks at the all of the kind of way in which the kind of the post-war world, the post-Cold War world was kind of put together, and the missed opportunities, the kind of missteps, and particularly looks at issues like the expansion of NATO, the implications of which we're thinking about now, of course, with the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So lastly, one last question. You do this like weekly podcast series on American purpose. I believe it's called Bookstack. Could you please like tell us a bit more about that?
So Bookstack is, as you say, the podcast of American Purpose magazine, which was the magazine set up by Francis Fukuyama in 2020, and very much the idea behind the magazine and the podcast itself is to kind of create a space for what Arthur Schlesinger, somebody that I worked on, always described as the vital center. In other words, that politics, particularly in the United States, has kind of become so polarized that the center ground has kind of become completely hollowed out. So Bookstack, the podcast, takes authors of new books, but from across the political spectrum, and kind of tries to provide a forum where kind of people of different political persuasions, different approaches to history and politics and society and culture and so on, that it's a kind of place where their books can be discussed in a very kind of open kind of way. It's not an ideological podcast. The idea is that in many ways that we're kind of modeling kind of pluralism of ideas and so on, so that it's many voices, many different approaches in that kind of a way, with pluralism really being at the heart of what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and time with us. It was an absolute honor to speak with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure for me revisiting Sargent. I first started working on Sargent, unbelievably, in 1997. The book kind of came out a few years later. So it's been a real pleasure for me, not just to speak to you and share in the work of the centre, but to think about Sargent again, who was a character who I really enjoyed working on at the time.